and welcome to the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Dinning in Los Angeles.
Jon, this is episode 68. How are you feeling tonight?
I'm feeling pretty good, man. Closing out a very long week, as I know are you.
Yes, it's been a very long week.
Yours is long for different reasons.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be a great episode because we are talking about the October 2020 LSAT-Flex exam and all the things they did, all the tests they used, and the various scales on that. So we're going to talk through that. But let's start off with the drinks that we are having tonight. What have you chosen?
Yeah, well-deserved. Yours in particular, well-deserved. Mine is more, in a way, medicinal. I realize they always are. What was the Elon Musk tweet that alcohol is the solution?
Isn't it, though?
This is a little bit of that, where I'm wiped out. I'm frankly exhausted from long 14, 16-hour test days, one after another. We haven't had a break on this since Monday, so I couldn't decide between an Irish coffee and a vodka Red Bull, so I have both. This is usually what I do.
They're not in the same glass, however.
No, I did not mix them. That's an experiment for the weekend. But this is usually what I do when I can't decide. Just all of the above.
Double fisting is the way to go.
Yeah, something like that. How about you? You've got to be thirsty.
I am very thirsty, and kind of like the sub-theme of this episode is fire. As a lot of people know, one of the reasons this week has been so long for me is that Napa Valley had some serious fire issues, and they came quite close to me, about a half a block away from my house. So that caused me to evacuate down to Napa City itself. And I was in a hotel for most of the week of this test, which just makes things much, much harder, especially with an 8-year-old behind you who's wanting to have fun and yell and grab you during the middle of important conversations. So,
yeah. And of all the times this was particularly reasonable for her to want to have fun and scream and yell, it was her birthday week.
Yes, she turned 8 on Monday, and unfortunately, we had been evacuated the night before, so she got to enjoy that in a hotel. But thanks to many nice gifts, including some that you sent, Jon, she actually said afterwards that it was her best birthday ever. So
I love that so much. Uncle Fun trying to contribute over here.
She loves you. But in honor of that, the drink I'm having is called an Apple Firefall. And I told my wife what the situation was, and I said, I need you to make me something that would be, fire appropriate, but still in kind of like the sweeter vein. And so she has made this drink, I think up from scratch, although it's kind of based on some different drinks that she's familiar with. And it's got a shot of Fireball whiskey, the only whiskey I can really drink.
Yuck.
It's got a cup of apple cider, 2 shots of 7-Up or Sprite, and then there's some cinnamon kind of stuff on it as well. I think it's pretty good.
That's just remarkably creative. The best I could come up with was basically caffeine and booze. And she's over here with she's over here grating nutmeg and stuff. It's incredible.
That's what they do. I mean, with you, I think it's basically where's the glass and then which bottle, and then you just pour it right in.
Yeah, what's within arm's length, what's within reach, and that's what the drink is. So we'll post Dave's recipe for you guys if you want to try this for yourself. If you need my recipe, shame on you.
We'll still post it.
We can post it if you want. It's going to be a brief entry. That's really cool. She made that up?
She did make that up. I said, let's do something special for this since we're now back home. That's cool. Thrilled about that. And I will tell you that the situation of evacuating under a mandatory order with the police coming down your street and banging on doors is pretty crazy. And some of the pictures I took of the sky orange red and very angry behind me are kind of ominous and terrifying. And it was a strange thing because on Sunday morning, she actually woke me up at 5 a.m. and she's like, there's a fire. And I was like, where's the fire? And it was 3 miles away. So I was like, that's great. I'm going back to sleep.
Yeah, classic both of you.
Yeah, and that was what the start of the glass fire was, which did burn the other side of the valley very severely and caused people to lose their homes. Businesses and wineries were burned down. It was rather terrible. But that night, we were under a red flag, which is high fire conditions, and it was quite windy, and it blew embers across the valley onto Spring Mountain, and I live at the base of Spring Mountain, obviously with a bunch of other people. and that's where St. Helena is located. And that caused fires to pop up super fast, including one right behind me, maybe a quarter of a mile away, and it came down the hill. So that's when I looked up, and I got a message from one of my friends that says, "Are you at your house?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Why? I can see 150-foot fireballs in the air behind you." And I was like, "Well, I'm leaving." So threw a bunch of LSATs in the car, hit the road.
Yeah, man. Some of the pictures you took from your driveway look like Mad Max or something. Hellscape.
Somebody said it was Mordor.
Mordor. That's exactly right. I was waiting for like yes. Sauron or something to pop up. Well, I'm glad you're okay. I'm glad the house survived it. I'm glad you got to re-enter the liquor cabinet. Good for you.
Yeah, it smells like smoke in here, and there's ash all over the land.
But it tastes like hope.
Yeah, those things are livable. I feel bad for the people who had it much worse and who, lost their homes and what have you. So I'm quite grateful that this is the way that things have turned out. We actually had looters try to come through the neighborhood. It's one of those situations where you see the best of people and you see the worst of people. So glad we made it through. And let's move on.
Yeah, others weren't so lucky. Should we talk about the song? That's a horrible segue. I apologize.
That was bad. Evil segue. So anyway, we're talking about fire as the sub theme, and I'm going through all this list of songs that relate to fire, like Van Halen's "I'm on Fire," the Cult Firewoman, Pitbull's "Fireball," BTS even with "Burning Up." And then all of a sudden, John's like, "We need to go ahead and have Van Halen as the theme," and I'm like, "Why?" He's like, "Eddie Van Halen has died."
Yeah. Poor guy. Throat cancer got him at 65, which is, honestly, quite a good run given his lifestyle through most of the 70s, 80s, and even 90s. That dude was hitting it hard for 3 decades plus.
True, but Ozzy Osbourne's still alive, and I think it's inarguable he hit it even harder.
Oh, Keith Richards is 148. He's still going strong.
You sure he's that young?
Yeah. He's a Civil War veteran, Keith.
I will say this. You and I both play guitar to varying degrees of skill, but we both admire Eddie Van Halen because his guitar ability is just off the charts. And this song that we've chosen, "On Fire," is one of my favorites by Van Halen. It's the last song on Van Halen 1.
Yeah.
I probably played it about 4 weeks ago, actually. And if you go and listen to that song, you can hear David Lee Roth and I think Michael Anthony screaming in the background, the high notes, but just listen to the guitar that Van Halen plays. It's so clean yet distorted. It blows my mind. So I'm sorry that he has passed, and that is a great loss, but he certainly contributed a lot to the guitar playing.
He did. He was a pioneer. Guitar modification, too. There's a great story. I'm sure you know who Dimebag Darrell is. Guitarist for a number of bands. I think Pantera was the big one. He was shot and killed, and Eddie Van Halen went to his funeral and gave him that famous Bumblebee, the black and yellow guitar from Van Halen 2 cover. He gave him the original one and buried him with it. And Gene Simmons from Kiss donated the coffin. It was a Kiss-branded coffin. Dimebag Darrell's, buried in Kiss coffin.
But did Darrell really want to be
Eddie Van Halen's Bumblebee,
someone else's guitar? That's weird.
Yeah, he had asked Eddie Van Halen for one, if he could get one, and like one of the repo models, like a reproduction that they had done. But Van Halen buried him with the original. He said he was an original, he deserves the original. Into the ground.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And of course, if you're familiar with Michael Jackson's catalog and know the song "Beat It," there is a guitar solo in the middle of that song. That's Eddie Van Halen for you, who apparently was not paid for that.
I heard that,
The story I read was that he did it and he didn't want to get credited for it because it would cause some kind of issue with other band members in a contract they had. So he did it for a case of beer and put down like one of the most radical solos in the middle of like what was a really extreme pop song at that time.
Yeah, he's a stud. He'll be missed. It's a shame. But pour one out for Eddie. What else has been going on? Let's get to the meat of this, which is the LSAT World first and then the LSAT.
Yeah, let's talk about a few things really quickly. One question that's come up a lot recently has been from people who are abroad and which tests they can take. And I've noticed there's been some uncertainty about this with LSAC phone lines. The kind of definition of whether or not you can take a domestic or international test is not based upon your nationality. It is based upon where you are located. So if you are a United States citizen and you are over in England, you can't take a domestic test right now, a flex test. You have to take the international test, which is, if you're an international student and you are in the United States right now, you can take any domestic test. You don't have to take, and you technically cannot take, the international test. So I just want to remind everybody that it is based upon your location at the time of the test. And one of the reasons they do that is to stop cheating. So if you try to take it outside the country, my understanding is they have protocols in place to like shut down your IP and stop you from taking the test. So just be aware of that being an option or not being an option depending upon where you are at.
Yeah, you have to register for the test based on where your location will be when you try to log in. And they do track it, and all that like Tor, VPN, all of that stuff. It doesn't work. You can't get around it. So if you're going to be in North America, no matter where you're from, register for a North American test. If you're overseas, register for the appropriate international test, of which there are fewer dates. So be mindful of that.
Yeah, it's frustrating the way that works, but that's the way they have it for now. And who knows, maybe they'll open it up now that we have worldwide online tests going on, as we saw this week, because the October 3rd LSAT week essentially ended today with international test takers being a big part of that. So they got rolled into it, and I wouldn't mind seeing that happen constantly, although I know that that extends the business hours that LSAC has to work and all the related problems with that.
Yeah. We're recording this on Thursday night at the end of the final test day, the official test day. So that's why we're in the clear to talk about it, and also why I'm in the clear to double fist.
It is the evening time.
The sun is set. All bets are off.
Let's talk about something else that was a big problem last time, and I fear is going to be a big problem this time, and that is LSAT Writing.
Yeah.
I talked to my friends over at LSAC last Friday, and they gave me two interesting facts, I thought, which was that from the August test takers, over 2,000 people still had not taken the LSAT Writing and had not received their scores. That's amazing to me.
That's
so
incredible.
You have people who took the August test and are like, look, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that writing. 2,000 of them.
That's almost 10% of the people from August. Almost 1 in 10 people from August have got an LSAT score waiting on them, but they have not submitted an essay yet. Attempted to submit an essay, as I understand.
And I'm sure there's some really nice scores in there that people haven't gotten yet. They're just kind of like lazing along with it. So if you're one of those people, go take your test, your LSAT Writing. And I got an update on that number today, still at 2,000.
Yeah.
So that group is kind of like, we just don't want to deal with it. Now, what about the group that just took the test, the October test takers? Last Friday, 14,000 people from this administration still hadn't taken the LSAT Writing. And if you don't have one on record, you don't get your score when scores are released. So it is important to take it. Now, this week, it looks about like 3,500 people.
That's good.
Went out and took it. So that is a big positive. And now they're down to a bit over 10,000 people remaining. But you don't want to pressure the system here. Try to take this sooner as opposed to later. And I will say that the biggest problem with the way it all works is that a lot of test takers get flagged. Mm-hmm. They run into some kind of violation, and that slows down the whole process. And we talked about this previously. There are two queues. There's the queue of people who are free and clear, and they get processed very quickly. And then there's the queue of people who have committed a violation that caused them to get flagged, and they get put at the end of a very long, manually reviewed queue that works much more slowly.
Yeah.
You don't want to be at the end of that queue. There are 4 things that you have to be on the lookout for that will clear you out of that queue or get you flagged if you fail to, abide by the rules here. The first is show both sides of your scratch paper, and then tear it up at the end too.
Right.
As I recall, is part of the guidance.
Even if you're not prompted to do this by the proctor, just do it. Get this on film, on your camera. Have this as part of the recording. The proctor may not know to prompt you or forget or whatever, but if you've done it, it's one more thing that'll clear you through the queue. That's potential flags.
That's true in the LSAT itself. And in LSAT Writing, it's more of a, punch it and go. So you just want to go ahead and show that scratch paper and then tear it up.
Yeah, the proctoring, I should clarify, because the proctoring for the writing is automated in the sense.
Exactly.
There's instructions at the beginning that basically walk you through the process, but those instructions may not tell you to tear your paper up or show it. Just do it.
Or you might miss it. It might not be clear to you. Secondly, don't wear a smartwatch. This is a catastrophic failure. If you're wearing one, is my understanding, they will just invalidate your LSAT writing, and you'll go right back to the very end of the process or the beginning of the process and start all over again. There's no priority. Third, no cell phone or other items that they've explicitly disallowed. That will also cause a major problem. And then the last one is when you're checking in, you need that clear photo and to show yourself and the ID to the camera. So do those 4 things, or not do them depending upon the guidance there, and that will make it much easier to get through without being flagged. And the last time, as I recall, they were telling me that over 50% of the sessions have been flagged.
Yeah.
And they were very clear. They're like, can you please share this information, because we'd like people to be able to get it faster. And also, quite reasonably, we'd like to do less work in terms of having to police all of this.
Yeah.
So this time, apparently it's down to around 30%, which is a big positive. But still, that's thousands of people being flagged, and every one of them has to be hand processed. So if you can, make sure that when you're going to do this, that you think about those things and avoid causing an issue.
Yeah, as we'll talk about, if you think about the numbers here, that's still about 50% of all the people who tested in October who have not completed a writing yet. Now, you've got 2 weeks before the scores are set to release, but as Dave said, do not wait to the last week of this. If you do, the chances of you getting in this backlog, clog drain queue are higher and higher by the day. Get this done now.
And on that note,
let's talk about the October test.
Let's talk about the test itself.
All right.
So I think, the overall numbers when we get through this are probably going to be about 20 to 21,000 actual test takers. More were registered, but the way it's looking is that's what the final number of people taking it will be. And this was an interesting administration because Saturday and Sunday was when it started, and you had about 10,000 people and change take it over those 2 days. Saturday was a little bit bigger than Sunday, but incredibly, Saturday was one of the smoothest days that I ever recall for an LSAT-Flex administration. So that was really, really nice. I got very few messages. I don't even recall more than one where someone had a problem. I didn't see a whole lot online where there were issues. And I know that kept the wait times down in terms of their phones. It allowed people to get onboarded into the system to take the test very quickly, which is exactly what we want to see every day of this Flex.
Yep.
Then Monday, day off.
Yes, it was.
That was great.
Feels like a
month
month
ago. That was my daughter's birthday, and she was like, what? No, I might have that backwards. No, it was actually.
Yeah. Monday was the day off and your daughter's birthday. And the reason that I know both of those things and you don't is a real shame for you. You're forgiven this week, but get with it, man.
You actually got it wrong. It's
what?
It's a week earlier. I'm the one that's right here. I was like, wait, I've got the Mondays confused. I do actually know my child's birthday. You do not.
Do I not?
I forgot how long I was in that hotel.
Oh, that's right. You were there for consecutive Mondays. This is on me, audience. Dave knows his daughter better than I do.
I apologize in advance because I swear I am exhausted. It has been a rough 2 weeks with the evacuation followed by what has been some really long LSAT days here.
Yeah, you evacuated the week prior to this test starting this past weekend, so you were there for quite a long stretch. This past Monday was a day off. You were still in the hotel, but your daughter was 8 years and 1 week at that point.
That's exactly right. And then Tuesday was a smaller day. I think there was around 3,500 people who were taking the test. Wednesday, even smaller because a lot of accommodated test takers kicked in. And then today, Thursday, was 7,000 people. My understanding was the biggest day of the week.
Yeah.
And part of that was, that you had a lot of people taking it domestically who kind of pushed it back in the week. And then you had a bunch of international test takers as well. And so they had their special phone numbers open again. And if you look at the tweets that I've sent about the availability, today was the longest period of time that the phone lines were open. And that was because of the international testers.
Yeah, they seem to almost all be on Thursday. Possibly was all. There may have been some exceptions, as we'll talk about with Wednesday a little bit. That was a special day for accommodations and things.
Yeah, and I would say that the early part of this test seemed to go really well. I saw a few more issues as the week went on with proctors not necessarily being clear, connections, some Wi-Fi connections being problematic. We got a message from a student who had a paper and pencil accommodation that I have yet to respond to, but borderline disaster with that. So it was a really smooth start. I think as it went on, as always, when there's thousands of people, there's going to be some inevitable problems, and we saw a little bit of that in the last 2 days. Overall, though, still better than what I've seen from prior administrations, and I think we can all agree that's what we want, although the goal here is perfection, not just better. So moving in the right direction, I'll take that for what it is. And for those of you who had troubles and got disconnected or had real issues, I'm certainly sorry about that, and I think it's a terrible thing. So keep fighting for your rights there.
Yeah, completely agree. The trend line is positive, but still not good enough, in my opinion. But again, small victories, right?
Yeah, the standard here that you and I have is 100%, and that's a really high standard. And I think we both know that's a tough one to reach, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have it, man. I tell every student, shoot for 180.
Shoot for the stars.
You may fall short, but shoot for it, because go for the gold.
So part of the problems that we've seen over the week were obviously out of the hands of the test taker. There was nothing really the student can do about spotty internet, perhaps, or proctor confusion or proctor delays or things happening with ProctorU. But there are still things that I think students can do to at least ensure on their end that things go as well as possible. Should we touch on a few of those? We did it for writing already. Let's do it for the test itself.
Let's do that. And let me make a comment. A lot of these issues come down to ProctorU. I continued to remain convinced that the so-called spotty Wi-Fi is server overload. Do I have proof of that? No. Will some people get mad at me for speculating in that? Of course. Do they work at ProctorU? Most likely. So there is definitely that. But I just keep being suspicious of what I'm seeing with this. This many people suddenly have spotty Wi-Fi. I'm like, I don't know. I've seen people who have been plugged into their office internet, which is like the old T1, T3 level where it's massive data, and they're like, they're telling me it's unstable. I'm like, no, it's not. So there is that. And then the proctoring situation. The paper and pencil person was run through a whole bunch of proctors who simply weren't prepared to deal with the situation that was being presented to them. So some of this is still on ProctorU, and they are the vendor here. So let's hope they can continue to get it together. But as you said, there's a few things that students can do to make their situation better. Do you want to run through those?
Yeah, some of these will seem reminiscent of the writing stuff that we talked about too, which is just make sure the setup, the environment in which you are taking the test is as sort of idealized as possible. One item of which is make sure there's enough light in the room. I think particularly in the early morning or late evening, when there might not be as much ambient light coming through a window or something. If you have to bring in a lamp or something from another room, just make sure that there's enough light so they can see your face and your ID as you hold it up, and so that there's never any suspicion of what's happening off camera or slightly out of frame. They need to be able to essentially see the room. We talked about this last time, and still confounds me a little bit, but you must select the answer choice by clicking within the oval, A through E, that you intend to pick. You cannot just eliminate the other 4 answers and expect it to give you credit for what's left. I would have never thought that was a problem, but apparently it continues to be an issue for some students. And then at the end, do rip up your scratch paper, even if the proctor doesn't tell you to. If you're not instructed to, hold it up to the camera, make a show of it, tear it up, toss it.
Yeah. If you don't, it's not the end of the world, but this just allows you to get through that much more quickly. It avoids any issues. It's something that's a known issue. So all those things just make the process a little bit easier, and possibly avoid having a proctor stop you in the middle to say something like, oh, I can't see you on the camera, because nobody wants a disruption during a test of this importance. Now, another thing I'm
going to add one more piece to this, because this is some advice that I've been giving people the past few days, including a webinar I did last night on test mentality where it came up. I had a student who was there was a student there last night who was taking the Flex today and didn't realize it wasn't 5 sections, which terrified me on all sorts of other different levels. So one, familiarize yourself with the Flex interface and format if you're not already. I hope that goes without saying. If you're listening to this, it probably does. But the other thing I've been telling people is have a conversation with the proctor before your test starts. There's a human being on the other side of the camera, on the other side of your chat window. Lay some ground rules out between the two of you. Hey, if you need me, remember you can pause this test. Put the chat box up. My speaker's on. If you need to get in touch with me, don't take control of my mouse. Say something and I'll stop, but pause the test. You can actually help give some guidance to the proctor to make your own life a little easier if something does need to be addressed midstream. And the other thing I heard from a lot of people about their proctors, this time more than others, was that a lot of proctors are giving like little pep talks and stuff. Did you hear this or see some of this?
I did.
I loved this. This made me so happy. This proctor's like,
it.
Hey, listen, you're going to do great today. That kind of thing, which is entirely unnecessary. It's not part of their protocol. But I loved it. That just warmed me up a little bit. It could be the Irish coffee talking, but I'm pretty sure.
How many of those you had already?
I'm on my first one here. But thinking back to, what is a stressful situation and this stranger kind of big brothering you through a lens, for them to just give any kind of word of encouragement, I thought that was the best.
You know what? It's always welcome.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing like somebody, being positive, and especially when it's unexpected like that.
Right.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because it's certainly something that I'd seen as well. And that's that really helps start things off well, And I love your advice there to, talk to the proctor, especially if you have a problem, please stop my timer. Mm-hmm. And don't start my timer again until we've resolved everything and it's ready to go again. Because some of these proctors don't understand how this works. They don't understand the importance of this test. They're under the impression, oh, you could just take it again tomorrow. And it's like, that's not really how it works, guys.
Yeah. When I see the advice of like, oh, just talk to your professor, I'm sure they'll understand. It's like, oh, God, we're on different planets.
There's no professor here.
That's right.
But
yeah, knowing there's a human being on the other side, especially if they express some humanity and encouragement, is great. But like I said, lay some ground rules. They'll be grateful too. You're in compliance. You want to do the right thing. Help them help you. It's important.
Agreed. I also want to remind everybody, and I think, again, this is one of those, sample situations where the people listening to this are already well aware of how it works, but it is, for those who may be tuning in for the first time, worthwhile to kind of remind people. I saw a lot of people talking about their section order, and they would see someone else had the same section order, and they would say, oh, I had the same test. That is not how the LSAT-Flex works. As we will detail once again, they cycle through different sections throughout the first couple of days, and then they mix and match all of that stuff towards the end. So you having the same section order as somebody else is not at all indicative of whether or not you had the same content as somebody else. You could have had the same order and really a completely different test.
Not a single moment of overlap, yeah. I keep seeing that too in conversations online. Somebody's like, I had reading comp, then games, then logical reasoning. And somebody will immediately in the comments be like, I had the same test. Like, you had the same
Yes,
order.
in form.
Right.
You had the same test, not necessarily in actual content that you're going through. So just be aware of that. It also means that sometimes people see things like that game's really hard or that reading comp's really hard, and then they start to feel fear, which is totally natural. If you're taking the test on Tuesday and you see the people on Saturday complaining about something really difficult, you're going to think to yourself, oh man, I'm screwed here. No, you're probably going to see a test that is at least partially different, if not wholly different at that point. There were, I think, by our calculation, the possibility of 45 different combinations on this test for domestic North American test takers. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of options. Someone else may get a reading comp that's brutal, you may not. You may get a logic games that's hard and they may not. Or you both might get, easy versions of that, which is something we're going to talk about next.
Easier. Neither one of us wants to make that mistake again, right? That's on me. If anyone's worried or wondering what I'm talking about and has a reasonable memory, I think I made a comment sort of loose-tonguedly once about like, oh, those games are pretty easy. And I got skewered over it. So,
well, yeah. Probably rightly so. I always tell you that. I'm like, it wasn't easy, Jon. It was easier.
That's fair. But right back at you. None of the stuff on this test was easy, but there are varying degrees of difficulty, as we'll outline, and some of it was objectively harder or easier than its competition, put it that way.
Yeah, this is in relation to some comments that are almost always made after these podcasts, where someone is like, man, I had this test, I thought it was hard, and then PowerScore said it was easy. I want to remind everybody as we talk about section difficulty, my personal belief is that every LSAT section is hard. There is difficulty in every single section out there. So when we start talking about easier or harder, it's in a relative position that's already difficult. The easier versions that we may mention here tonight aren't easy per se. They're just easier than, say, another section that someone else had. So keep that in mind. We're never saying, oh, it's an easy LSAT. I don't think those exist.
Right.
And I'm happy to say that over and over again. And so if you're looking at it and you're like, well, they gave me a scaling that was on the so-called tighter side, which indicates an easier LSAT, that still doesn't mean that your test was per se easy.
Yeah. In fact, I don't think those kinds of adjectives really work. This is all relative. It's all comparative. Within the context of the LSAT itself, which is by definition tough.
Don't make a relativity flaw. Let's put it that way. And I'm not going to explain what that is. We've talked about that elsewhere. There is a podcast where we talk about flaws, and that's in there. It's in the Logical Reasoning Bible in our courses. So acquaint yourself with that, because that's what that mistake is. If you're thinking that, we want you to avoid it.
You should know by now.
Yeah,
so
I thought.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I thought that the tests that we saw here were really interesting in terms of what they pulled from. We saw some strange things too. I mean, one of the trends that I'm seeing these days is that there are questions in the logical reasoning sections that are harder earlier on. Mm-hmm. And sometimes people say, well, that's because all these tests are new. That is not the case. And this is something that, from a segue standpoint, that I really want to talk about, because we see this online before every one of these tests. What prep test range should I study? Is this test from the 60s? They don't mean the 1960s. They mean prep test 60 through 69. Or should I study the 80s? Let's take a look very briefly at where some of the content from the October LSAT was pulled from.
Yeah. I like this. I feel like we started by just dispelling myth after myth. Just because you have the same order, it doesn't mean you had the same test. Just because we say it's easier doesn't mean it's easy. Yeah. And this is, again, the valuation really, or the how to prioritize what tests or what era of tests you study and where you can really find more value or less. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this, and the past week has proven it.
Yeah, there really is. For example, what's happening with these flex tests, as we'll go through in detail, is sometimes they are pulling full tests that we've seen before. February usage, for example, a test that was not previously released. And for those of you who are like, oh, I want to find out which tests they are so I can go look at them, you cannot go look at them. The questions that are coming from these tests are typically from non-disclosed LSATs. And what that means is they were used and then not given out. And so that doesn't allow you to go back and take a look at, say, the February 2016 LSAT, which was used in this administration. There's no way to see those questions. And that's some of the LSAT sections that were used. Other LSAT sections were newly created or drawn from various prior experimental usages. So going back to the point that Jon and I were talking about, what prep test era was this from? Well, let's take a look. That kind of like machines workers game that was about the press, riveter, and shredder, that game has appeared on experimentals as far back as, to our records, 2008.
Yep.
It appeared on other tests too. I remember there's a usage, I think, from 2011 or 2013. It was an experimental section on June 2014. That game is notable to us because it is known to be a difficult game. But if you're like, well, that was a game that was a lot like the 70s, now that game first appeared in the mid-50s.
Yeah.
So that takes you a long way back. And Jon and I often talk about the fact that older LSATs have high value, especially when you go into the really early LSATs. A lot of the logic games, I think, are highly valuable to do. This is a great example. This goes back over a decade. The international test that was used today was from 2011. And this is a test that's was first used right around the prep test of the mid-60s. So there's a usage from the 50s and the 60s. They used February 2016, which is from the late 70s prep test era. And they used other tests from, or sections or games at least from February and other months in 2018, that's the mid-80s.
Yeah, I'll go you one more recent. They actually used at least one passage on one of these reading comp sections from January 2019's experimental section.
That's right.
So it's a year and a half old, give or take.
That tells you that this test was drawn from a span that goes from the 50s all the way to basically to the present. It is really tough to say that a test is going to be from the 60s or the 70s. And while some people may get that, many other people won't. Don't isolate yourself by saying, I'm just going to study this small cluster. Sample from all the different tests that are out there. That will best prepare you going forward if you are in the position of having to take the LSAT again.
Yeah, I do think if you're in the position of having to take the LSAT again and only have a few tests to choose from due to finance or time or whatever it is, whatever constraints, typically more recent is, in my opinion, more valuable to know. If someone was like, should I really look at like September 2019 or September 2004 or whatever? I think that was an October year, but I would say do the more recent thing. But it does go to show there's no sense in ignoring older tests because we're seeing content come from them constantly. 12 years old, and we're seeing content still appear.
Yeah, and that's just as far back as I was able to track that.
Right.
And I'll be honest, given this crazy week that I had with the evacuation and then the long days, I did not have time to go back into our files even further. It could very well be that I could find some of this stuff is older than that. And while we're compiling all that, it isn't necessarily the case that it was just 2008. It could be earlier than that.
Dude,
and
you did more from a hotel room than most people could have done in Newtown. So don't sell yourself
they're
short.
Working in Newtown right now. They're all working at home, man.
Okay.
So there is nobody working in Newtown. It's the surrounding areas or
Fair enough. If they had left their files and the door unlocked, you did more from a hotel room than I could have done in Newtown.
It was, you know what? If you're stuck in a hotel room, tracking LSATs and working, that's not the worst thing that you can do with your time. I enjoyed it. So let's get into the actual test content. And what we'll do is we'll make a rundown in the rough order of how they introduced the sections.
Yeah, first
appearance.
And
then we'll summarize it at the end with the scale matrix that we like to talk about and give everybody a sense of like what the curve will look like. So Jon, what did they start off with on Saturday morning?
Saturday morning, bright and early. We woke up to really the first test in full that was being used. And this was a new, I'm doing air quotes that no one can see, a new test in the sense that this wasn't the classic just dusting off a reuse of a February. These were the logic games, 23 questions, that had the summer camp activities, the musician auditions, and the concert halls. A lot of people were talking about that game. Interesting game about anthropological discoveries, clay tablets and artifacts, the ages of them, I believe. And then a game that got a lot of people's attention and blood pressure up, which was the fashion brands, I believe, in a magazine. The final question from that Stores magazine, something like that. I think it was magazines.
I think that was the hardest game in this section, too.
By all reports. And it's always a little tough to tell when people claim the fourth is the hardest because there's a time pressure element that exists there that's slightly unique. Usually the fourth game's the last thing people are doing. Difficulties compounded if you're running out of time. But from the sound of it, I do think that was the toughest game.
Agreed. And then they pulled out a reading comprehension section that was also kind of, I'm not going to say cobbled together. I mean, all LSAT sections are truly cobbled together from prior experimentals. But this was a tough reading comprehension section. It's the one that starts off with a passage most easily identified as about the Creole language. But Pringle and Prince's personal narrative, the false transcription.
Yeah.
A lot of people said this was deceptively hard and wasn't really the happy start to the reading comprehension section they were looking for.
Yeah, it's deceptively hard to pronounce. I can say it's a tongue twister of a title that I heard people. Pringle's pruning of Prince's personal narrative. My goodness.
I like a little tongue twister there.
Yeah, she sells seashells. I was like,
Sally.
That was the first one. What was 2?
That was the lawyer-client relationships passage. The third passage was probably the hardest in this section by all accounts. It's a passage that we saw back as an experimental on the February 2018 LSAT. This was about Darwin and evolution and gene plasticity. So tough passage. So the first and third passages here, not easy. And then the last one was about bartering and currency and a bit of anthropology on like economic system history. Mm-hmm. So sounds to me like a passage set that I would have liked. I think you probably would have liked this too. It's got some of our interests and strengths in there.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of people felt that this was, after a logic game section, whatever order they had, that was, tough but not impossible. More in the middle, followed up with a reading comprehension section that was kind of rough.
Yeah,
so,
it's funny you mentioned that comparative passage about gene plasticity. As soon as I heard those two words, I was like, I know where that's from. I remember that.
Me too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sometimes, it only takes one or two words that you might hear, and then all of a sudden you're like, I've heard that before. And certainly with both you and I think we have really good memories, and we're so immersed in the LSAT that a lot of times I hear questions, and I'll send you a message and be like, I know this passage. Yeah. I have to go pin it down, but I can find that whether it's LR or RC, which is, I think for us, a huge advantage to have had this much time to be immersed in all of this.
For sure. You did it today with the international test within seconds. You're like, oh, this. I was like, poof.
I saw the word treasure, and I was like, I know what this is. Treasure RC, yeah, I got you.
Yeah.
So then,
keep going.
I was going to say, that was largely the logic games and reading comprehension that we saw on Saturday. And what we're going to do here is, as we talk about this, we'll talk about each day and what was primarily introduced. There can be some bleed over. You can see some stuff come in late on a Saturday that was primarily used on Sunday. We'll just talk about it in that fashion. We originally were looking at the logical reasoning and thinking there might be two sections, and then realized there were actually three sections that were used throughout Saturday. And I think that all of these sections were pretty reasonable. I know that some people right now are cursing at me. I'm not saying they were easy. I'm saying they were reasonable within the LSAT world, which largely is going to mean that they're not going to have a huge impact, especially two of them. One of them might. The first passage was, the first logical reasoning section was 26 questions. This is the one about shin splints would be the easiest way.
Old people with the shin splints, yeah.
Yeah, the vipers and the venom and the melanoma was another one. This had conspiracy theories in it. This was one of the sections that I heard had some tough early questions in it. All right, so that was one of them. Another section that we saw, 25 questions, dealt with dinosaurs and rocks, sleep and memory, some idea about lies and false statements, a vaccine that has a 9-month recovery period, even chimps in that one as well.
Right, store brands, independent and retail, I think that was in there as well.
Yeah.
And those were the two that we saw for the majority of the day. Certainly through the morning and most of the afternoon. Those four sections, the games and reading comp we outlined in those two sections of LR just now, that seemed to be the bulk of Saturday, but it wasn't the entirety of it.
No, a little bit later on in the day, it seemed like they introduced this third section, which, if I recall correctly, our assessment of this is that it was on the relatively easier side of logical reasoning.
I love how egg-shelled we've become.
Must be careful not to say it was
dance
easy.
Around these trigger words.
Yeah. And this was I think the first question on there was about coffee and disease, and there was a question about shareholders and board nominations, barge traffic on a river, CEOs going to other companies, and then a question about Florida Everglades, the swamps, and pythons. And you can see right away, you had a question in the first section I was talking about vipers. Here you have pythons. Notice how confusing that would be for people to figure out which section they'd taken because, to me, I'm like a bunch of snakes. So...
yeah,
these were different
coffee and
sections.
Disease, something about vaccines and recovery. I think the other one had something about venom and melanoma. So, there's common themes throughout, but certainly different enough topicality that we could tell the sections apart.
Well, then one of these sections had a question on volleyball, and then one of the logic games used volleyball.
That's right.
As one of the topics or the variables. And it's like, that's the kind of thing where I think that's really smart test making. This is why I admire the LSAT. They're like, we're going to confuse you by having common topics in different sections and making it really difficult for you. And again,
difficult for us. Yeah.
For those of you who are like, man, they're disclosing a tremendous amount of information. Does me telling you that a question about shin splints exists, does that change how you scored? No, but it helps you understand, all right, where was my section within the panoply of sections that were out there, and what's the perception of difficulty? I think this last section about the Florida Everglades and the pythons and the barge traffic, this was probably the easiest, relatively speaking, of the three. And we're going to see that's going to have an effect later on when we take a look at the scales.
Yeah, but that's all we're doing in identifying this, is just allowing people after the fact retroactively to look back and say, all right, well then this is one that changes my scale in this way, or I had that, and here's how they think it'll affect the scale in the other direction. That's all this is. We haven't given anybody an advantage aside from maybe self-assessment.
Yeah, this is all after the fact, considering what you're going to do. But on Saturday, it looks like the same logic games and reading comp were pretty much used all day, and then these three sections were floating around in there. And our theory, I think, Jon, was that they were going to have fewer sections in use. I think we got a little nervous that they might actually add more because this was not a small test.
Right.
But it turned out that I think they had just slightly fewer, and I don't think they need this many still. There's still so many. I don't think the average person who doesn't devote 12 hours a day to this is going to figure this out. So then we wake up on Sunday. I wake up in a hotel, not on vacation.
Right. No.
And what happens?
Sunday kicked off right away with a brand new set of games and a brand new set of reading comprehension. Specifically, this is where they began to use the February 2016 LSAT. The games for that test that we saw Sunday morning, the first one's about a furniture sale, different items over several months. The second game was artists being assigned or ordered into some 5 spots, I believe. Game 3 had people going to conferences in 3 cities, London, Madrid, and Paris. Probably the toughest game, as we'll continue to touch on. And then the final game there was books on a bookshelf, ordering them. Hemingway was the one author that I saw being tossed around for that game, which felt like a new game as it was talked about later in the week, but it turns out it was just that one.
Yeah.
So those were the games that we saw Sunday, and again, easy to place because they were from a past test that had been used in full, non-disclosed, but February 2016. And then they pulled in the reading comp from that same test, February 2016. 27 questions. This is the section that started with a passage about Edmonia Lewis, who was a female sculptor. She was not a sculptor. The second passage was about regulations, worker-employee representation rights, ethics. Passage that I would like to read, I hope one day to get the chance to, about smart growth, urban smart growth and suburban sprawl. This was the comparative. And then another passage that probably would have been a treat for me, which was about this botanist, Hooper, British botanist, and his theories on aging hedges and shrubs in England, English shrubs, which sounds very English indeed. But those were the 4 passages. And we also saw the 2 logical reasoning sections from that test come in, 26 and 25. Should I touch on some questions from those as well, just round out the set?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. The 26 question LR from February 2016 had moths and bats making sounds. I think that might have actually been the first question. Tweak sounds, which I won't do an impression of, but apparently that was the noise.
You just did.
I kind of. I could do a better one, but I won't. There was burglars with initials. This almost inspired my drink today, which was a question on absinthe.
Yeah.
Proper absinthe, the only kind that matters, with wormwood in it. Something you and I have been privileged enough to actually sample in real life.
In Amsterdam, and this is the second time we've mentioned on this podcast.
That's right, yeah.
That is a hard drink to drink straight, I will tell you, but I suffered through it.
I got pretty good by the third one.
Did you see the Green Fairy?
I'm not sure what I saw. I saw us scaling canal bridges all night like animals until 4 a.m, so...
Was it 4? I thought it was 5. I remember it being daylight as we were going back to the hotel. We were with a bunch of people on that trip, too.
It wasn't just you and me running wild through Holland.
Good times.
And then the other section from February 2016, 25 questions. This is the one that had highways and electronic toll system. There was one about too many traffic tickets, one about altruistic behavior that I saw a lot of people talking about. So that was the test in full use on Sunday morning. And again, there could be some bleed as well. There could have very well been some more instances of those Saturday questions coming in. But that's what we saw primarily dominate the morning Sunday.
Yeah, and that February 2016 LSAT was a really reasonable one. We knew they hadn't used it. And I can say that we had a very strong feeling that it was going to appear this time around. If you look at the history and if you're able to track this, you can kind of see what has and has not been used. And so this was one of the big February tests that hadn't yet appeared and was due to come up. And it's a test that has appeared elsewhere. I mean, it certainly was used in February 2016, but it also popped up in 2018 as an international exam in both February and June. So having it come back domestically would work out just fine. And this is also part of the reason why they separate out domestic and international test takers, is because they have given them different tests in the past, and they're trying to avoid that bleed over.
Yeah, less duplication. It's funny, if people could see our text history, they would realize just how many of these were actually predicting like the night before. When February 2016 didn't happen Saturday, you and I were both like, I know what we're waking up to.
I thought there was a decent chance we'd start off with that test.
I did too, yeah. That's why I say when it wasn't Saturday, I think we felt even more confident it was coming. I think people seeing our text history would also wonder how we've managed to keep this podcast PG.
Indeed.
Things get salty in private.
Force of personal will that allows it to be PG.
Not us.
So that was, largely what we saw early on Sunday. And as Sunday progressed, they went back to using the reading comprehension that we saw from Saturday. And then late in the day, I think to our surprise, we saw a new logic game section come into play. And I did not expect that to happen.
I didn't either.
So when I saw it occur, I know that our immediate response was, oh man, are they just going to keep adding more and more test sections? Because why burn so many when it's already hard enough to keep track of this? But the logic games that started coming in on Sunday and that were then used subsequently through Tuesday as well as through today were the section that is 23 questions, best described as the one that ends with Game 4 from Hell, which is the Riveter press and shredder game.
The machines,
and a lot of people were,
machines,
quote unquote, being shredded by that game. And that is a very hard game. That is the game I was mentioning before, where it was used in February of 2008 on the experimental. It showed up in February 2011, February 2013, June 2014, all as an experimental. So they were certainly tweaking it and maybe seeing how it worked with the other games. I can say this, and this will come back later on. The first three games, none of them approached the difficulty of the fourth game. I know there were some challenges with the second game, but the first and the third game on that section don't look to have been overly challenging as far as LSAT games go, and that's going to have an effect on the scaling that we predict. But if you thought they got to the last game and it was brutal and it hurt you, yeah, you weren't alone. There were a lot of people out there who felt exactly the same way.
What were those first three games that were comparatively
That's a good
easier?
question now.
Awesome.
There was a game about interviews and job candidates. There was a game about concerts and really opening and main acts. And then a game about authors and books.
Another one with authors and books, yeah.
And really even like the concert or the performances, you can see how tricky this gets to kind of run everything down. So that was the section that we started to see, and you've seen a lot of people online complain about the fourth game being tough. It was. There's no doubt about that. We can see that clearly.
So let's take an inventory up to this point. We've seen now 3 sets of logic games.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen 2 sets of reading comp. And 3 on the first day, 2 new on the second day, so 5 total sets of logical reasoning. And we had just started to get kind of comfortable, at least I had, Sunday afternoon, thinking the day was winding down, Monday was a break, and here come these new games. Of course, 11th hour surprise.
I didn't like it.
I did not. But it did, in a way, set me up for the rest of the week, because at least I had that information. And as it turns out, that was the last of the games that we would see this week, aside from internationals.
Yeah, and they did recycle the earlier games. Remember, it doesn't just go, oh, that's the last game and you never see it. That's the only one you see. You see those earlier sections come back. Even today, I saw people going back and referring to the game about like the fashion boutique or the fashion brands, and going back to earlier reading comprehension as well, and going back and talking about shin splints. So it then begins cycling, and they mix and match all these different sections together. So it doesn't go away, and that's why somebody can take the test on Saturday, and then they have a totally different test on Sunday, and then by the time they get to Tuesday or Thursday, there's a totally different test for them. This is how they stop cheating. They stop information from being shared that might be prejudicial, and they try to keep it as fair as possible. And to be honest, I support it.
I do too.
So I think that's the way to do it. And it's also why we don't do this podcast on Monday or daily, because we could certainly update it daily, but then the people who had taken the test would be giving information to people who were still to take it, and I can't abide by that.
Yeah, and heaven help us if we had done this Sunday afternoon and during our recording that new set of games popped in. That would have felt like a real missed opportunity. So.
And I will say this, there's always a cohort of people who are trying to press us throughout the week to tell them what we think is coming up next. We will not do that.
We won't.
And we can see you. Some people are very aggressive, like, what's going on with this? Now, if somebody took the test and they're done and they're like, tell me about the scale, I don't have a problem with that idea of like, nothing's changed or what have you. But if I know you haven't taken the test and you're trying to extract information from me about it, you're not going to get it.
Yeah.
So it's not worth your time trying.
I respect the hustle, but to no avail, I'm afraid.
Yeah, exactly. And those people doing it know who they are because they won't stop. They're always like, tell me about this. And I saw it online, too, where somebody was asking about that press shredder game and repeatedly trying to get people to tell them what type of game it was and what the setup was. And I finally was like, stop doing this.
Yeah,
you're going to get yourself in trouble, and I don't want to see that happen. And if someone else tells you, they're going to get in trouble, and I don't want to see that happen. So we talk about difficulty. We talk about general topics because none of that's prejudicial. I think LSAC is okay with that because they know people want to know and they don't want to drive them underground to start sharing a whole lot of information. But it is not fair to others to go into detail about setups or rules or answer choices. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, that sunlight's a disinfectant idea plays here. Because if they did try to shut all this down, it would drive it underground and then it's the Wild West again. That's what we don't want. We specifically don't want it. But test takers ultimately shouldn't either. We weren't quite done. We had Monday off.
Woo.
But then Tuesday morning started with the final new piece, which was a third reading comprehension section. Still using logic games, many from Sunday afternoon, the shredder game, that also pressed and riveted, as it turned out. The shrubbery was in use there, that reading comp from Sunday, from Feb 16. The new reading comprehension section, though, not from a February test, had a passage about the African novel, the author, passage about what I believe was electromagnetic frequencies, EMF, and I think some lawsuits or damage from those and who's liable. Tree fungus, and then privatization was the final passage there, I think.
Yeah, not another section that was not easy overall, but that was the last one that they rolled in. And this was one that, experimentals we saw from January of 2019, the experimentals on that test that were used here. That is a really short cycle in general, but that, again, goes back to the point we were making before. You don't know where they're pulling these tests from, where these questions are coming. It could be the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. You don't know. So careful in terms of like assuming it's going to be the 70s or it's going to be the 80s. I hate for people to get into kind of like a mental groove and then be surprised when it didn't turn out to be that way. Agreed. Now, the nice thing here is that rundown, accepting international test takers, completes the sections that we had. So as you counted it out before, we now have 3 logic games, 3 reading comp, and we've got 5 logical reasoning floating around. That is 45 separate combinations if they chose to, mix and match every variation. That's a really good example of why it's hard to think you're going to learn a whole lot about something that then makes a definite concrete difference on your test. And I have continued to think that it is not worth the time spent. It's better just to focus on doing well.
Yeah, 100%. That's what I always tell people when they ask me. Like, not only will I not tell you, but I can actually caution you against worrying too much about it. You're doing yourself a harm here, a disservice. You're distracting yourself from the process of actually solving things by trying to match them up or determine them in advance.
Yeah, and so that meant that, for example, today, among the domestic North American test takers, they just saw variations of what had already come out earlier in the week. Mm-hmm. And again, section order doesn't really matter. It's all about the various topics that you had that will determine the curve. The difference that you had, though, is that you also had international test takers in the mix. International test takers had the February 2011 LSAT. So again, going way back into the history there, back to like till the 60s or so, for that exam. And if you're wondering which test that was the logic games with plows and then an exhibition of paintings. It was the reading comprehension with the shipwreck / treasure hunt and a passage about civil rights. And then you had two kind of fairly middle of the road logical reasoning. But if you had that plows and shipwreck combination, then you were looking at February 2011. And right now, I can tell you that the scale prediction we made on that test, when it was used previously, and it was used in June 2020 domestically, as well as July 2020 as a makeup LSAT. Mm-hmm. That's why they didn't give it again to the regular domestic test takers today. We predicted the scaling on that for the Flex is -8. So right here and now for international test takers, that's your test. -8's the prediction on that. You're over and done with as far as information.
Yeah, as a whole swath of listeners just turned this off.
Bye.
That's fine.
That's okay.
That's what they're here for. That's what they get. Yeah, I think that Feb 11 test internationally today, Thursday, -8. That's my call. Regardless of your logical reasoning, -8.
Yeah, that was a reasonable test, I felt. And when we talked about it back in June, our assessment of it was that it was fair. One of the things that we've predicted repeatedly is that these tests end up being kind of middle of the road because they don't want to do anything too crazy. And it's probably the case that press shredder game is maybe the hardest game that's been thrown out so far. But even so, the rest of the section offset that to a great extent and made it at least livable. So on that note, Jon, now that we've knocked out the international section and we've kind of covered all the test sections that were used, do you want to talk about the scaling combinations that we have?
Nah, I think we're good.
You want to talk about Eddie Van Halen and his incredible guitar tone for a while.
How does he play that part with the taps?
I think I told you this the other day that I used to be able to play part of Eruption. And
I'm not surprised. You're a good guitarist.
I'm up and down. But I always enjoyed doing that, and then I'd get to the part where I'm like, I can't do this. There's like 4 or 5 taps going on, and it's just too difficult. So, yeah. Oh wait, should we talk about the scaling?
I guess we should.
Okay.
You almost drug me into a Van Halen hole. I'm happy to go down. Yeah, let's talk about how this is going to work. For those who maybe haven't seen us do this before, do you want to give the broad context, the structure really of how we tend to work the matrix out?
Yeah, usually what we do is we start with a baseline score, often -7 as your scale. And I will remind everybody that what that means is you could miss 7 questions to get a 170. This has become kind of like the standard marker that shows top line difficulty and reflects, whether a test was logically harder or logically easier, especially at the top level. And so these flex scales can really go from anywhere from about -6 conceivably up to about -10, although they tend to stay in the middle because there's a little bit less variation since you only have 75 questions. So when we start talking about -7 or -8 or -6, we are referring specifically to the number of questions that you can miss on your test to get a 170.
Yeah. And the reason we do this on your test is it is specific to each exam. The individualized section difficulty changes what your scale is going to be, even from people who had the same order or took it at the same time. So again, we have to match this up to individual component parts before you can make this kind of determination. Let me put one other disclaimer on it, if you'll indulge me. And that is that I don't think we err at all. But if we do make a mistake, we tend to make it in the direction of a slightly more conservative expectation. In other words, if we say -7, chances are better that it's a -8 than a -6. If we say -8, chances are better that it's a -9 than a -7. We tend to be a little tighter, and then, in a way, almost hope that we're wrong in your favor.
Always hope we're wrong.
Exactly, yeah. If I say -8, I hope it's -15. It's not, but I can still root for it. So if people hear this and listen to us go through this, or have heard it in the past and think, man, these guys are stingy, it's meant to be a little bit that way. We still think we're right, but we also know that if we're going to make a mistake, it's probably on the tight end, not the loose end.
Yeah, if you're going to talk about scales like this, it is better to be a bit conservative than a bit liberal.
Perfect.
And I think we both agree on that. However, hopefully at this point, through the discussion that you heard us talk about your sections. And so as we go through this, you'll again have to pick out your section and then correspond it to what we started off with, which is the -7. And I'm going to start with reading comprehension here, because I feel like this is maybe the least controversial. Not in logical reasoning. Logic games is going to be more controversial, so I may take my time in getting there. So again, we know there were 3 different sections that were used. And this is tough because it's clear to me that some of these sections are slightly harder than others from what I know about them through their historical use and from what I can gain from talking to students and so forth and really reading what they've written about it. But the first passage was the one we saw on Saturday, and this was the Creole and the lawyer relationships and the Darwin gene plasticity. And if you start at a -7 as your baseline, that's what we start with, this would loosen the scale by 1. This would add and take you from -7 to -8. The next passage is the Edmonia Lewis and then the Suburban Sprawl and the Shrubs Hedges passage. Good news here, same effect. I'm not sure that this was quite as hard as the gene plasticity, but we're going to go ahead and do this, and maybe I'll make mention of how tough this can be at times. So this would also add 1 to your scale. So if, again, you're -7, you go to -8. And then the third reading comprehension passage that was in use was the one about the African novelist, the EMF, the privatization, and the tree fungi, which I think was cocoa trees. Guess what?
Right.
Also adding 1 to your scale. Reading comp's had some tough sections recently, and I felt like all 3 of these were justifiable. If they didn't add a full 1, they added like 0.75 to the scale, and that was enough to say, let's push it over. So no matter what your reading comprehension was, you just got moved from 7 to 8. And I know a few people out there are like, it wasn't that tough. I realize that. That's always the case. There are always some people who find something easy when it was hard, and some people who find it hard when it was easy. Again, relatively speaking.
Right.
In this case, the majority perception and the effect that it would have across the board made us feel like you could add 1 here. So,
yeah, I agree. And look, difficulty doesn't arise from an individual experience anyway. It arises from the collective outcomes. So
truly,
we have to look. If I have, a 178 kind of test taker and like, man, those games felt great, I would hope so. But you're probably not the best barometer. You're not the litmus test here. We have to take this, again, from the full scope of what we hear. All of these reading comprehension sections, in my opinion as well, Dave, would loosen it. And I wish we could stop here. People would be so happy. Just like, hey.
Well, it's also a compilation. Like, I may look at this one reading comprehension passage and think, well, it was the baseline I use is medium difficulty, like right down the middle. Like if you were to say everything's got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rating, I start at everything being a 3. And then I look at it and say, is this a 4? Is it a 3? Is it a 2? And so you might get a reading comprehension section that is pretty tough, but not as hard as the others. And it adds a 0.75 to the scale. And then you might have a logic game that adds 0.25. The way we do this, it's binary, 0, 1. And that's because that's the only way for us to do it. Otherwise, it would just be a mathematical nightmare. But those two things together added 1 to your scale, even though both were on the harder side. So with some trepidation, let me wade into logic games.
I'm just waiting for the day when we start doing this in fractions. Like your scale was -7 3/8.
We talked about that. I was like, I'm not getting into a world where I'm like, this is 0.5, that's 0.25.
Don't tempt me.
I feel like I could order these out in a way that it was relative, but I don't want to get into percentages or decimals or fractions.
Thank you.
So let's get into logic games. Now you've got 3 sections here. The first was the Saturday start of the activities, then the musicians and auditions, then the clay tablets and the kind of like the artifacts, and then the fashion brands. I have really vacillated on this between saying that it added 1 or was 0. Jon, you want intercede here?
I wish I could tip you one direction or the other. I got the impression that while there was some difficulty here, I don't think it's enough to tip this up another full point.
I agree.
I would probably leave this at 0. So if you were to -8 after reading comp, as everyone was, then I think you stay there with this set of games.
Yeah, and this is going to be a theme that we see throughout this, in all likelihood. because I agree with you there. This section had difficulty. And one of the things I would remind everybody is that the fourth game was really tough. And if you got to that fourth game and you leave that section, your last impression is of doing something really hard, and it makes the whole section feel tough. I don't think this was an easy section. I don't think this was easier than medium. I just don't think that it adds a full point to the scale. I think it moves it a little bit, and then they're able to balance it out with the rest so that you do get credit for that. But the way we're doing this and trying to describe it, it doesn't move it on top of the point that the reading comprehension already moved it.
Yeah. If reading comp was a point plus, this might finish that final second point gap, but I don't think collectively they're enough for 2 points. That's basically how I look at it. And again, I know we said we wouldn't do this in fractions, but that with the reading comp in this section, I think comfortably -1 in addition to what you had. So yeah, I'm good at -8. It could maybe be -8 and a little more.
Yeah. The second Logic Games one we saw was from February 2016. This was the furniture sale, the artists, then the London, Paris, Madrid conferences, and then last the bookshelf. This does not move the scale either. I know some people complained. They were like, that London, Paris, Madrid game's tough. I believe that it is. In fact, I think all these game sections are slightly harder than average. So I'm not discounting that. And I don't want any angry DMs about being dismissive. It is not that way. It's just that the way we're looking at this, in almost all cases, the logic games combined with the reading comprehension, they were both on the harder side. They both add up to being one looser. So no matter what your scaling is, and it's at 8 at this point, the first two logic games haven't added anything.
Yeah.
It's
would you
still
say
at
that set
-8.
of games, the London, Madrid, Paris game, would you say that was of the three, the easiest of the three, or the most reasonable of the three?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree.
So for me, I felt very strongly about that doesn't move the scale. The fashion brands game, that was the first one we talked about. I've debated that. Then we get to the last of the three sections that were used. And this is really, we'll just talk about it based on the last game. This was the machines, the press, shredder, riveting game. Boy, this is a tough one for me. I hope someday to be able to see this section and that they release it so I can make what I would call like the firsthand in-person assessment and really get my own direct sense of it. I'm going to leave this as not changing the scale. I mean, I know some people right now just spit out their coffee or maybe drove into a telephone pole. I hope not. Or threw something against the wall. That's not my intention here. Let me go back and explain why I feel that way. And then, Jon, you can either agree or disagree. And if somebody came back to me and was like, look, you're totally wrong, it does add 1, I'll concede that point. This is, I think, debatable.
I wouldn't fight too hard against someone. I also didn't spit any coffee out because mine has whiskey in it.
Don't waste the precious whiskey.
Yeah, no spit takes when there's booze. But explain your reasoning. I'm probably going to agree with you, but let's see.
Yeah, and again, I feel bad about this because I know so many people were like, that game brutalized me. And I get that. The problem is that it's not just about one game. What I know of the rest of that section is fairly substantial. And essentially the way that it worked was the first 3 games were nowhere near the difficulty of that last game, especially the first and the third games. You should have been gaining points there. The second game, I understand that there were some challenges with that game. However, there were a number of people who got into this section and arrived at the last game with more than 10 minutes. Certainly not everybody, all right? But when a large percentage of people have that experience, what's happening is that they are cruising through the first couple of games knowing that something tougher is coming. And again, if you're looking at it, you're like, there is no way that that's the case. I accept your disagreement and I support it. It's like Patrick Henry. You can go ahead and disagree and I support your right to do that. I'm trying to make the broadest, most neutral assessment, and I think it's on the borderline. But I'm going to go ahead and leave this as not changing the scale, and that's because with some of the reading comprehension, we gave it a little bit of extra. We probably could have said, all these games change it by 1 and none of the reading comp does, but I didn't think that was nearly as fair as what we did. So in this case, all the reading comprehension and logic games combinations leave you at -8.
Yeah, if there was going to be a -9 through the games and the reading comp, it would be with that set of games.
Yeah.
But again, too, we also have said right away that we were going to err, if at all, on the side of being more conservative. This is where I wouldn't fight somebody who wanted to really argue for a -9. My conservative instincts keep me at a -8 here.
Yeah, last game you did, super brutal. Whole section feels terrible. Guessed on a lot of them. I saw a lot of comments to that effect, and I heard a few from people I talked to. However, I heard a lot of people be like, well, I know I nailed the first couple of games. At least half that section I didn't have a problem with, and the other game I did well on. So I was able to get a few, and all of a sudden it's like if you did well on 3 games and that last game was in there, you might already have had 16 or 17 right, and then whatever else you were able to garner on top of that from that 4th game, that makes it that you actually did pretty well despite having a rough ending. So keep that in mind. That's how we're looking at this. And I feel bad about it. I feel regret, Jon.
Do you?
I do.
Well, I feel a little bit too, for what it's worth. I always want to loosen the scale as much as possible, but at the same time, I don't have good enough cause for it in this case. But again, I'm going to be pretty docile about this if somebody wants to fight back.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll see comments online tomorrow that are like, they're crazy, you're nuts. And I'll probably weigh in and be like, no, I explained this. Sometimes people like to summarize what we've said, and I'm like, don't just put the numbers up there. Put the explanation of why we said it and what we meant by it, or at least say they talked about this at, the 60-minute mark or whatever we're at right now.
Yeah. You said before, you're like, I don't want to hear. I was just thinking to myself, like, yeah, that'll do it.
Shouting into the wind. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Let's get to the logical reasoning, which I think is largely pretty easy for us to go through. Most of these sections don't have an effect. Only one does have an effect. So again, kind of in the rough order of usage, the section about the shin splints and the cast iron and the Neanderthals and the feathers, no effect. The section about the dinosaurs and the rocks, the sleep memory, the store brands, no effect. The third section that started being used on Saturday, this is the one about the shareholders and the barge traffic, the CEOs, I think maybe even the fish oil. That is going to take one away from your scaling. So if you were a -8, and you were at this point, you're now down to -7. And then the last 2 sections from February 2016, one of them was about moths, the burglars, the absinthe. That has no effect. And then the last one about the toll systems, the altruistic behavior, and so forth, also no effect. So every scale on here is either -8 or -7. And most of them are -8.
Yeah. Only one logical reasoning of the 5 used would take you to a -7. Everything else puts you at a -8, just like the International February 2011 test, -8, for anyone who didn't catch that before. So this is a much more uniform scaling than we've seen in the past. I believe our range for August was all the way from -6 to about -10, potentially. This felt like a far more consistent set of difficulty, regardless of content.
I thought so too, although I certainly know that some people are like, it should be -9 for some of those games. And again, Jon and I have said clearly,
it could be.
We accept that. I'm not going to complain about it and argue about it too much. This is just the best assessment we can make given the information that we have and the history of what I know about the various usages here. So that is the rundown. Hopefully people are still listening and our friends still.
I'll put it this way too. I don't think there's any scale that's going to be looser than -9. I'm very confident that the vast majority are going to be -8. I can't imagine anything tighter than -7.
That's a good way of putting it. It's typically going to be somewhere in there, and I don't see any -6 here. I don't see anything crazy. There's no -10 that's out there. There's a tight range on this, and it felt that way throughout it. I heard a lot of people say, yeah, it was rough, especially today. I heard a lot more people, upset about the difficulty today as compared to the weekend, and I don't know why that's the case. Maybe they're just more vocal today, but I saw a few more complaints. The next point of order is that the scores from this test will come out on the 23rd of this month. So at this point, a lot of times people say, why can't they get scores out any faster? That's 15 days from now. That is pretty quick. They will not start processing all this until everything's done. And technically, it won't be done until sometime on Friday because they'll have a few retesters in there who'll probably be taking the test at about the time that we've released this or,
presumably
before it. So the 23rd is when scores will come out. I do not anticipate scores being early. They haven't been early in quite a while. They have so many LSAT writing people to get through that they're going to take every second. So if you're hoping that it's going to come out any earlier than 9 a.m. on that morning, I am here to say with some confidence, I don't think so.
Yeah, don't hold your breath. I'm going to put 2 footnotes to this. One, scores will come out that day if you're not among the people who have yet to complete a writing sample by then or have one finalized by then. And secondly, all that will come out that day is your score. So all of these scale predictions, all the content that we've just discussed, you will not see it. This is a non-disclosed test.
Yep. Score, percentile, that's it.
Yeah.
No answer sheets.
Right.
No nothing. So that gets us through the October test. The next test, Jon, the November LSAT. And now that's turning very quickly. It's basically a month away from what we're looking at here. And I think that's November 7th or so that starts. So
yeah, they moved it up a week.
Exactly a month.
That's right.
I will say something if you're not aware of it. Every once in a while, we do crystal balls when we feel like we've garnered enough information over time to give us a view of what might be coming next. We are going to do a live crystal ball webinar, not a podcast. We're going to do a live webinar for the November LSAT. Always a fun time. Jon and I will both be there. We're going to do that on November 2nd. And as you may recall, if you've ever heard one of those before, we talk about what has historically been on the test. We often make predictions about what we think we're going to see. And obviously, as we track all these test usages, that informs us in terms of what we might think could be coming next. So we have some ideas there that we will share with everybody on November 2nd. If you get a chance, we have a page on our website that goes through free seminars. Go there, check it out, sign up if you're interested. There's also a ton of other free seminars that cover admissions, basic LSAT concepts. Just about every week or every other week, we're doing something that is free and live. And not only do we cover the content that we want to talk about, but we also take questions at the end. We'll do that on the Crystal Ball, and then I'll be doing an admissions seminar that's coming up sometime in November as well. Take questions there. And Jon, it's over now, but you did the test mentality last night, so congratulations.
Sure did. Yeah, congratulations. Thank you. I appreciate that. It was fun. All of these are fun. I wish that you and I could do more of them because, frankly, we love to engage with people. Most of the engagement that we have is one-on-one. So to be able to have a room full of people, a full audience like that, is it's always a fun twist. I'll mention, too, for the Crystal Ball, the most immediate focus of that discussion will obviously be the test that starts 5 days later. But we'll gaze deeper into the ball than just November. We'll make some talking points about January, February. We may even know more about the nature of those tests, the format, a month from now. No guarantees on that.
Let's just say my strong feeling is that relatively soon we will be hearing that January and February move to the Flex format. I don't know when that's actually going to happen, but I don't think they're going to delay much longer. It's becoming obvious and inevitable that that's the way it's going to be. So I think we'll see that relatively soon.
Yeah, I'm sad to agree, but I do. So yeah, that Crystal Ball, even if you're not taking the test in November, I think you'll still find it quite relevant to when you do end up taking it. So join us if you can, and sign up for some other ones too. They're fun, they're free, and we get drug into all kinds of little rabbit holes and tangents and things too. So they're not only free, sometimes they're free for all.
And the last 30 minutes when we turn off the recordings, I think sometimes the most fun.
That's when it really goes off the rails in the best way.
It's good times. And it also gives you an opportunity to see what other people are worried about, what they're asking about, the way things might go. And so we'll get into that, but that's coming up, the Crystal Ball, at least on November 2nd. That's the next time I think you and I will be on the mic jointly in a live, kind of like online format, aside from this podcast. Anything to add?
No, that covers it and then some. So I'm good with it, man. It's good to hear your voice, echoing from your office and not from the Westin or whatever.
And for those of you wondering, yes, my office smells like smoke. So I wish that it did not. I wish there was not ash all over. But like I said before, I feel fortunate about it. I'm also exhausted. So I'm going to go get another drink, restock, see if I can get some liquid energy. I hope you do the same tonight, Jon.
Yeah, man. Give your girls a hug for me. I'm glad everybody's safe and back home. So, yeah, man, good work.
Appreciate it.
Nicely done.
If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And if you enjoy it, please leave us a comment or give us a rating. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. Until next time, Jon and I are signing off. Stay safe out there.